Pedagogically speaking, it's great to get your students to be able to internalize the beat, to count out loud, to tap their feet, to be able to move. But when it comes to the bow, sometimes we can throw all of that musicianship right out the window if we don't understand the bow technique. Because for string players, our bow has an enormous influence on the rhythm. The bow has its own natural tendency, and we can fight against those tendencies. Some of the greatest players could probably play anything with any sort of bowing just fine. But if we're playing with a middle school orchestra, those tendencies really appear and are really exaggerated. And so it's better to set them up for success. And when they have to make an exception to the rule and fight against those tendencies, let's try to do that in a way that is predictable and conducive to what they're doing here. I tend to be the one that bows the string parts for our community orchestra. And guess what? Nobody likes my bowings, because everybody has their own personal idea about how something should be played or what's comfortable for them. But I think we can all agree that there are some general ideas that transfer from work to work. And sometimes when we play something, it just feels backwards or it feels wrong. And a lot of the times that has to be where the down bows and up bows fall metrically. If we have a strong beat 1 and perhaps even a strong beat 3, those tend to be down bows, and we tend to sort of reorder things to make those happen that way. Of course, this does depend upon style as well. Like for Baroque music, that's not always the case. But for more romantic music and definitely for modern music, we tend to bow it that way for sure. So for some people, in measure 6 and 7, here for your second violins and violas, this is going to feel backwards for a lot of players because we start beat 1 with an up bow, and then beat 1 of the next measure with an up bow also, and we don't get back to down bow until measure 8. If that bowing becomes uncomfortable for your seconds and or violas, you might want to try a different bowing there. There's a couple of different things that you can do. You could try maybe a double up bow here on beat 4 of measure 5, and as long as they can re-grab, that should sound just fine, and then they can be on a down bow from the downbeat of measure 6, and they can also be on a down bow for the downbeat of measure 7, and they might feel more comfortable that way. You're going to have to re-articulate here to have another down bow or do another double up bow or something to get back on track for 18. But there's a lot of these asymmetrical patterns that are used. Whenever we have a measure with 6/8 notes and 1/4 note, we end up with an asymmetrical pattern, and we're going to have to either bow backwards for a while until it works itself out, or we're going to have to modify the bowing so that the strong beats are down bow. It's just something to think about and to try to make it as comfortable as possible for your players. There's really no right way to do it or wrong way to do it as long as you're articulating. Just for some people, it might feel backwards. Measure 14 tends to drag. Almost every orchestra I've ever heard play this has really slowed down at 14. Why is this? Well, let's look at it. We have this up bow quarter note, down bow half note, and then up bow half note tied to a quarter note, and then 8th notes. Now, everybody should be able to count and clap this just fine, and they have no problem at all. But when they add the bow to it, they start to slow down. Cellos and basses tend to play in the lower half of the bow anyway, especially the younger players. They're more comfortable there because they can get away with more bad habits and still sound okay in the lower half of the bow than they can in other places. If they've got a bad bow hold, if you've got a lot of cello or bass players that extend the pinky and tightens up this part of the hand so that they don't have as much wrist dexterity, then they tend to play better at the frog, and a lot of them play there exclusively. So if they start up bowing right from the frog and they up bow, down bow, up bow, well then now they're going to be down bow and at the frog here for these 8th note quarter notes, and that's going to make them slow down. It's going to be the same thing here in measure 17. 17 should be a little easier because it starts with a quarter note and you can pull out to a bit higher in the bow to get the eighth notes. But measure 19, eighth notes are on beat 2 again. So each occurrence of this iteration of the rhythm slows down the cell's basses more and more and more. Sometimes the second violins and violas slow down with them. They're trading these E's back and forth, and sometimes in that trade, they'll go with the cellos instead of go with the actual beat, and sometimes they will just take off and leave the cellos and basses on their own. And then that's going to be a big mess because hopefully everybody gets back in at measure 20 when the first violins come back in with the second violins. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess. One of the ways we can fix this is to start this up bow here in 13 in the middle of the bow, down bow all the way to the tip, and then use a heavy up bow and try to get to the middle for beat 2 of 15. If we're able to get back to the middle, we've got a much better chance at not slowing down, because the natural tendency is to play faster notes at the middle because we have more wrist and fingertip flexibility, and it's just easier to do it that way. In the middle, at the frog, it tends to slow us down, especially if we have players that are using bad bow holds and don't have the best technique. In some ways, it is also their technique that slows them down too, but we still want to get everybody towards the middle because they have to give up that bad technique in order to get to the middle and grip the string and sound good. They have to also give up the shoulder, using so much shoulder, and start using some of the more fine motor muscle groups to play the shorter valued notes. Work on that slowly. Have them stop on beat 2 of measure 15. Have them stop on beat 2 in 17 and 19. Make sure everybody is in the middle and provide that accountability by making everybody stop right there and not go on. Make sure everybody's in the middle of the bow. It's important to establish that so that when everybody gets back in at 20, everyone's nice and together. And then finally we get our first homorhythmic section here in 21, where we have 4 quarter notes with accents on all 4 of them that crescendo up to a forte in 22. In 20, we've got double up bows and cellos and basses. I would just have them slur that and not re-grip so much. Have them articulate that with the left hand. That way they can get some more power and weight down on the string. I think that would be a better bowing here for most orchestras. Measure 46 is similar to measure 14, except this time we've got the melody in the first, second violins. Now, they don't tend to drag quite as much. The tendencies for violinists and violists are usually to play in the upper half of the bow, because when their wrist locks and they start opening up the shoulder for short values inappropriately, they sound better in the upper half of the bow. At the frog, it sounds terrible if you're using your shoulder like that. So they can get away with it more in the upper half of the bow. That's why they don't typically drag as much, but it's still good to have them understand what they're doing, making sure that they're able to get to the middle of the bow and then stop on beat 2 of 47, make sure everybody's in the middle, and then you can go on, have them stop in 49 on beat 2, make sure everybody can get to the middle. These are some pretty long bows in the viola part there at 46, and also in 50, 51. It's a whole note tied to a dotted half note, and it's forte. So again, those long bows are really going to come in handy. They're going to have to put down a lot of weight. And think about those kids that are playing on fractional size instruments. They might be playing on a 12 or 13 inch viola, and they don't really make strings for a 12 or 13 inch viola. They just take regular viola strings and put them in a different package with a different color, and they say, here you go, and you just kind of string them up looser to get those pitches for the open strings. But especially, just the research and development costs that it would take to develop something like a tungsten C string to that size, they would never make their money back, not in 100 years. So you're dealing with your own set of problems already for violists that are playing on fractional size instruments. They don't have the same amount of tension that they should have. So if you're playing this anywhere but bowing lane 2 or maybe bowing lane 1.5, it's not going to work because they're going to bend the string too far and start hitting double stops. So they really need to be in control of their bow, and they really need to understand bowing lane. And I should have mentioned that earlier as well for measure 14. If your cellos and bass players aren't playing in a good bowing lane here, that melody is not going to sound very good. It's not going to project, and it's not going to give it the character that it needs to have. So again, bowing lane 2 for them as well. Most students are going to do okay with a quarter, eighth, quarter, eighth. That's not going to be a problem for a lot of students. What tends to be the problem is eighth, rest, eighth, rest, eighth. That's the rhythm that we tend to see in Book 1, Twinkle Star, where it's Dr. Suzuki says practice it carefully. And if you've ever worked with beginning students that are playing that, they will rush if you don't set them up correctly, and the same thing here. Now, to slow them down, I will create something for them to do in that rest, and that's going to be a reset and re-grip for each up bow. And all the students are required to down, up, and then reset, down, up, set, up, down, up, set, up, down, up, set, up, down, up. I don't like them to stop the bow on the string approaching a rest. I think that sounds really bad. I don't like that style of release for this. So I have them come off the string for the up bow, reset, re-grip, up, down, up, off the string, set, re-grip. And it just makes a much more mature sound, and it keeps them from rushing because they've got a job to do during the rest, and they're not going to just blow through it. And who knows what's going to happen at the end of this if you've got violas and cellists just doing whatever. Are they going to make it to 36? Who knows? Again, when your cellos and bass players are playing this, have them play at the same place where your violas are playing. That's probably going to be towards the middle, somewhere in between the middle and the balance point area. If they're playing this at the frog, we're going to end up with a lot of problems. Cellos and basses also need to brush off and re-grip as well. They also need to use the same technique. In measure 67 here, we've got another double up bow, and the cellos and basses are going to have to re-grip. The basses are on the A string, so they're really going to need a lot of grip because there's a lot of activation force required to resonate that string. I mean, think about how much metal is in that string. You really have to be able to grip and activate it and reactivate again for the second note, which is beat 4. Look at what's happening prior to this. Quarter note, quarter rest, quarter note, quarter rest for low strings all the way through. And then finally they come in and start sustaining sound with everybody else, which is going to build up to this climax towards the end. And if you want this piece to sound great and you want to make it sound like Ablaze, then you're going to have to get them to come in with some might. And if they can't grip the string, and if they're playing in a bad bowing lane, it's not going to come off the way that it should. In 72, as we're approaching the end here, if we want more power from our violin section, we might want to consider re-bowing this so that we come in up bow, and then we have a stronger down bow at 73. Yes, we're all going to need to get back to down bow at 74, but we could slur these notes in first violins. We can add a staggered up bow for second violins, and both of those are also going to generate more power. So if you need more power, you can re-bow it to get it that way. This also might depend on your orchestra size. If you've got a larger orchestra, you may not need to do that. If you've got 8 to 12 violins, you might need some more power to make the ending more effective. In 76, again, we need to make sure that our violas, cellos, and basses are in the middle of the bow for these eighth notes. And we also need to make sure, really, that the violins are in the middle of the bow, too. And the reason why is, as we're approaching 79, we have détaché 16th notes for the first time. And those really need to be in the middle. If we're at the frog trying to play détaché 16th notes, it's going to be a huge problem. We've got cellos that are shifting up to join the violas here so they can be in unison E's. It indicates that we shift first finger to the D third finger. You could do it that way. There's no problem with that, but you could also play fourth finger second position or just do a little extension there. Since this is a grade 2 piece, we don't have to do a full shift there if we don't want to, and it's not going to make any difference at all because we're just coming back down to the B, and then, first finger on the A string, first finger on the D string for the E. But the important thing is that their bows are on the right spot, and sometimes when they're hunting for that E, their bows will start to do weird stuff because they're thinking too much about the left hand. And so we got to really make them concentrate and make sure that they're at the middle of the bow. All right, so we've got good tone and we've got good bowings so that the students can stay together and play with good rhythm. Now we can start talking about style and how we can add some of these stylized bowings that we have, some of these articulation markings that we have, and how we can apply these to all of the dynamic levels that are written in this piece so that we can be consistent no matter how loud or soft we're playing. So we'll see you in the next one.